Hello, good evening, and welcome to It's a Living. No, hi guys and gals. This is Liviana again. I have had a conversation with the QQ yesterday afternoon. So that was the 1st of July, 2017. And in the course of our conversation, I found some common ground, and I think we came to a bit of an understanding with one another. So we have what might be called a non-aggression pact at the moment. Anyway, so I had an encounter with the Púca, with a Púca. And so I'd like to talk with you all about some of the things that were said. Excuse me. So I'm not violating any confidentiality here. Our conversation was a private message on Discord, but he said, before you say anything, I would like to preemptively state that I am currently acting in my capacity as a reporter, and so anything communicated between the two of us here has no expectation of confidentiality and should be considered to be on the record unless an off-the-record interlude is requested. So that was his own statement, and therefore I don't think there's anything here that can't be stated publicly. So I'm not going to read the entire private message here. There was a lot of interpersonal stuff where we hashed out some of our differences and so forth. So anyway, I'm sorry, I've just made some coffee and it went down the wrong hole, so to speak. So as we were talking, there were some things that we discussed about the history of Gamergate, and let's see if I can get to the point here where he yeah, okay, so he showed me some articles and a graphic that were done by Chris Marb back in 2015, I guess. And so I have seen the graphic before. I had seen it before. I haven't read the two articles yet. I kind of skimmed over the first one. And in these, he talks about, Chris Marb talks about Gamergate is not a movement. This was also a thing that was in a video, a stream, sort of a conversation between Netscape and Fidron back in 2015. So let's see here. Oh goodness. Oh yeah. Okay, so as we were talking, the QQ and I said, okay, so he said, the brand by which he was referring to the name Gamergate is not hospitable for people like me because of gatekeeping to shrink the tent. I can't make the kind of videos I want to make and place them under the GG brand, because if I do, someone like Netscape or one of his denizens will be along to tell me how what I said in the video wasn't real GG, and that I am not a real GGer, and so on. So, and he goes on and says some other stuff. My final video, he says, on GG took the most controversial post from GGR, did a reading of it with a brief intro, and published it on YouTube for all to see. It was intended as a giant middle finger to the gatekeepers, and I wanted that to be closure, but I don't have closure. And so I responded to him, and I said, I can't say that because I recognize, and let me address something here. I'll also say that I don't agree with Didrin or Chris Marb that GG is not a movement. It is, as far as I'm concerned, a consumer revolt, and also a developer and other games industry insider revolt, frankly, movement against forces outside, including fake journos who themselves aren't actually gamers, but just people who fancy themselves writers of some sort and want to make money and such. And I think those people are kind of treading water in games journalism until maybe they're hoping to get hired by something more mainstream. And then I said, but also there's people like Anita who want to impose their sterile vapidity on the development and publishing of games. But anyway, I recognize that there is more than one faction within this movement, and while I disagree with some, I'm not sure I could justifiably say that person is not a real GGer based on mere disagreement alone. So then he says, what it is and what it should be are two different things. I think the whole movement thing plays into the anti-GG hands, and yes, anti-GG is a real cohesive clique, or about 4 of them really. ZQ's SA goon buddies, Anita's academic peers, Wu's clique, and Harper's clique. GG used to be the name of the scandal. By referring it to be the name of the people opposed to the scandal, it does 2 semantic tricks. It makes it harder to talk about the scandal, as the scandal has lost its canonical name, and it diminishes the impact of those opposed. Look at it as if you were a big company somewhere in gaming. If someone were to tell you hundreds of thousands of your consumer base, a significant percentage of gamers, are pissed off about this one thing, well, that is a major problem. If you view it as a percent of a total number of gamers, then any given gamer could be one of the pissed off ones, and you have to manage things very carefully. However, if it is a movement where people are all grouped up, it is no longer a percent of this total. It can be generalized. It can be generalized as some radical fringe that nobody should care about anyway. This is what Catherine Cross did in her white paper. She was an Anita clique member and academic feminist, and one of the first to define it as a movement and put them at a tactical advantage. So then he shows me some graphics, and I should have set those up to be shown here in the video, but I didn't. He says it was a 2-phase attack. First, drive a wedge between gamers and Gamergate, paint them as isolated from each other, using propaganda written by academics like Cross and journalists like Too Many to Mention. Then once that was done, drive a wedge between gamers, people who play games because they value games, and players, people who play games to pass the time. Using the existence of the Gamergate boogeyman, they were largely responsible for creating in the first place as a new wedge. So I say, you'd say Gamergate is the name of the scandal or scandals, and then those who were upset about the scandal or scandals are gamers? And he said, some percentage of gamers. Gamers itself is an amorphous blob with many unique goals, and engaging in many means to achieve those ends. But it's a lot easier to pick out from the amorphous blob those you wish to exclude from the conversation if all the ones with a certain concern group and label themselves. An example, gamers are boycotting X, a serious problem. Gamergate is boycotting X, a joke. Heck, a company could spin this into positive PR by saying misogynists hate our product or service. But this is a 2014 perspective. It's a bit too late now. So yeah, that was an interesting conversation. That particular bit right there was particularly interesting. I am still gonna say, I mean, I don't really know of any alternative name to give to this movement, because at this point in time it is a movement, whatever it started out being. Now, I understand, obviously, that Gamergate would have been a name for a scandal, much like Watergate was the name of a scandal. And this proclivity to attach gate to the name of something to refer to some scandal. This has a history going back, of course, to the 70s with Watergate. So yeah, obviously, Gamergate was a name used to refer to the scandals, or the scandal initially of the nepotism and corruption within video games journalism. So yes, I understand where QQ is coming from here. But anyway, as time went on, those who were rebelling against things like the Gamers Are Dead articles and revolting against corruption in video games journalism and so forth, came to be known by this name, Gamergate or Gamergaters. So, and I think there is some reason to have a name for the movement. But as I said, there are a number of factions within Gamergate. There is, of course, the GGR people, the Gamergate Revolt people, and they were the people who were willing and apparently intended to engage in doxing and harassment and so forth. Which I agree with Netscape on this. I think this is an ineffective tactic. It only serves to make Gamergate look bad, as if we are harassers or a hate group or misogynists or whatever. And so, I mean, there were the mainstream Gamergaters, and included among them were a sort of what QQ refers to as gatekeepers, I think was the term he used. People who went around on patrol, basically. I think that's a name that I've seen used to refer to them in the past, that they were a patrol who went about trying to weed out the bad actors, if you will. Let me see here. Now, I had a conversation with Brad Glasgow and some other people on Twitter here. I guess it's been a couple of weeks ago now. And Barfu Gaming and Brad Glasgow and maybe some others. So I wanted them. They had brought up Old School Gamer P. Had also had mentioned this. They had all kind of talked about this concept of factions within Gamergate, and of course I was aware of some of the different factions, but I wanted to ask them about what factions they perceive within Gamergate. Now, I guess it was Old School Gamer had said that Gamergate, and this is a quote, Gamergate was consumed by internal conflicts between a faction that cared about optics and a faction that thought media image was unwinnable. So we got some, I got some replies from Old School Gamer, and let's see here. I'm gonna just read some of this here. So Old School Gamer says, it's a tricky landscape as you can divide into origin, 4chan, Reddit, YouTube, and ideological motivation, gaming, ethics, free speech. There is some cross-cutting. Some pre-existing groups were also involved, not all positive influences. 4chan brought in people from the boards B and Poll. These were among the earliest. The wide censorship on Reddit involving Total Biscuit brought in a lot of people, as did Internet Aristocrat and Mundane Matt's videos. The Gamers Are Dead articles, of course, those brought in a huge swell of your normal average gamers. The major internal struggles was between those wanting to improve public relations and get Gamergate fair news coverage and those who thought this was a distraction, plus those who thought pushing ethics would negate the need for an ideological fight and those claiming the ideology was cause of bad ethics. You'd need a book to describe this in proper detail. I'm glad Brad Glasgow is writing one, as well as Grimmachu. So then, oh mercy. So then there was something at Slate some time back where there were a couple of things, a table with loosely pro Gamergate and loosely anti Gamergate, where they talked about some factions that they perceived. So then someone called Mikey comes in and says there were many factions in the Gamergate discussion. Some cared about ethics, some didn't. And Brad Glasgow said there must be at least 12 different factions in GG alone, and that's not touching anti-GG or them neutrals. So I've got to skip down a bit here to get to the next section. Alright, so then Barford Gaming comes in, and he says, most people in Gamergate took on more than one role, at least during the height of the usage of the tag. Now those roles, while being kind of similar in what they were doing it for very, very different reasons. We had diggers scouring the net for information on topics that would interest GG. I'd separate those in three groups: ethics in gaming, ethics in journalism, and drama. And yeah, we had a whole army of drama makers, let's be real. Then we had the information dispensers. Most diggers were also information dispensers, but not all, for some reason or other. A lot of people didn't participate in the digging, but were very helpful in sharing the info that was found. Then we had those trying to affect actual visible change, whether through petitions, charity drives, contacting the authorities, etc. We had what was called the harassment patrol. That was it, harassment patrol, and other movements trying to make sure the most toxic elements of GG were opposed by GG. We can divide those into two groups: those who actually cared and those who only did it as a strategy to make GG look good in the media. On the other hand, we had a bunch of people who were trying hard to veer GG into harassment and doxing and stuff. Again, those can be divided in multiple groups. Some actually opposed GG, and that was their way to do so. Some thought, we're not going to win the image battle against the biased media, might as well go all in the other way. Then you also had the common shit posters, not really into Gamergate for any ideological reasons, just enjoying the memes and the ride. To sum all this up neatly, I'd say, in my opinion, those were the factions involved on the side of Gamergate. Games diggers, journo diggers, drama diggers, info autists, info sharer, RL strike team, harassment patrol, image patrol, GG revolt, shit posters, Twitter. And then we have the e-celebs too. That I kind of forgot, since they usually fit nicely in a niche, but not all of them, though. That's it, in my opinion. You catch pretty much everyone that used the tag while being pro with those. Many of the 4chan crowd, being all about anonymity, hated the e-celebs and tried to drive them out. Many moderates tried to drive out Ralph. A lot of cultures came together while there were common goals, but once those felt less urgent, Gamergate fractured. But what remains is a sort of consciousness of Gamergate issues. Some are well connected still because of Skynet. Gamergate won't ever go away. So, So I replied and I said, Gamergate Revolt were the actual harassers. I don't remember who I was answering here at this point, but someone had asked a question, I think. And I said, Gamergate Revolt were the actual harassers, plus allegedly some trolls from the Something Awful forum site. This was referred to by the QQ in our conversation yesterday, where he talked about Zoe Quinn and the SA Goon pals, her SA Goon friends, or whatever he called them. Yeah, the Something Awful forum site has at least some people in it refer to themselves as the Goon Squad, and I've mentioned them before in one of my previous videos where I talk about how they have been griefers and trolls and so forth in games across various platforms and companies and so forth. I've encountered them in a few different contexts. Not to name any names at the moment. Eventually I might, but at this point in time I don't think there's any point in going into the specifics. Basically, there are people who go into games and try to annoy people to the point that those people will say something or do something that can get them banned, and then they report those people and get them banned, when in reality they're the ones who start all the crap and so on. And they also have a presence in the gaming fora of the various games companies and so forth, where they agitate for what could be called neo-Puritan or pseudo-Puritan goals, like you shouldn't be allowed to wear swimsuits off Ryza, for example, in Star Trek Online. And in some cases, I think maybe maybe some of them actually are neo-Puritan in that. But in other cases, I think they're just doing it for the lulz, and to screw with people, and to frustrate people as much as possible, and therefore I would call them pseudo-Puritan. There are other people I refer to as pseudo-Puritan because I don't think they actually believe some of the crap that they say. They're just using it as a means of conning others out of money or whatever. Anyway, so after I brought up about Gamergate revolt and something awful, Old School Gamer returned to the conversation and says, "I think the TWC, maybe GNAA, people also fanned the flames. Around that time, some Lizard Squad dude had been harassing female gamers and got arrested. But whatever happened and whoever did what, Gamergate always got the blame. It was the games media's enemy and a handy whipping boy." GNAA, Brad Glasgow then comes in and says, GNAA was definitely involved, also Bill Wagoner crew, etc. Old School Gamer says, I think Camera Lady had some GNAA background and asked them not to troll, but that doesn't mean they didn't. Brad Glasgow said, I had some GNAA come after me. So then I replied again, and I said, in response to Old School Gamer, Barfoot Gaming, and Brad Glasgow, I find your discussion of roles very interesting. You give diggers or scourers, oddists, and sharers, similar to intel work, of which a major portion is classified generally as information collection, coordination, and intelligence requirement management, and which consists of four main functions: information collection, analysis of information to derive intelligence from it, then intel packaging and intel dissemination. And then there may be some more to the conversation after that, but that's all that I had saved for the time being. So, yeah, that is quite an interesting discussion there. And let me see. I have this these tables from I think that was Slate. Let me check and see here. Well, yeah, like I said, I should have made sure that I had all of these images prepared for the video, but I mostly wanted to address the issues that I had mentioned in my last video with regard to QQ, where I kind of wasn't particularly nice to the guy, and I think, you know, we are going to disagree about various things, but I think we're at a point now where we kind of understand one another and are not going to be at each other's throats. As far as Netscape's Gamergate Discord, QQ has made it plain that he has little or no interest in being a part of that. So, yeah, from Slate here, they have a table in this article, which is called How to End Gamergate. So their table is divided into two columns. On the one side, they have loosely pro Gamergate. Let's see now. Let me back up and, oh yeah, okay. So there's a little bit of commentary about this before they get to the table, and a little bit after. And it says, but how do you deal with an amorphous, leaderless, chaotic, and incomprehensible movement like Gamergate? There are no less than 16 factions actively involved on either side, by my count, each with their own particular agendas and resentments. At this point, the sides are defined less by ideology than by A, antagonism towards some faction on the other side, and B, the willingness to accept or despise the Gamergate label. So then the author or authors give this table, like I said, with 2 columns. On the one side it says loosely pro-Gamergate, and it lists the following: hardcore and mantle gamers, revanchist movement misogynists, heterodox social justice heretics, disgruntled game journalists and devs, heterodox feminists, anti-identity politics liberals, libertarians, and anti-liberal media conservatives. And then on the other, in the other column, it has loosely anti-Gamergate, and it gives middle-brow gaming media, indie gaming scene, social justice orthodoxy, and in parentheses it says Tumblr, shit Reddit says, etc., Gawker, Vice, and other hipster media, progressive media, for example, Vox and Verge. And I have to object here because Vox is in no way progressive. Oh my God. And I'm also going to object to the, on the loosely pro-Gamergate side, anti-identity politics liberals. In my experience, in talking in particular about American society, these people that are, going back to 1988, or back to the 80s generally, throughout the 80s, the Republicans did their best to turn the term liberal into an insult. And there were a number of prongs to this attack. There were some from what would eventually become known as the religious right, with their emphasis on fundamentalism, Protestant fundamentalism, and fundamentalism back in the 1920s, whenever it first came into existence and was given a name, I guess I should say, because I think it was always a kind of current within the Protestant sect, but in the 1920s, I guess, was when it was first called fundamentalism. And that was as a result of the publication of a series of books called The Fundamentals. Well, I don't know, they should be called books, but ultimately they can all be boiled down into a single or a double volume of essays, basically. And so the fundamentals were what these various so-called conservative theologians regarded as the fundamentals of the Christian faith, and they included such things as the concept that the Bible was verbally inspired by God, and that means, essentially God possessed the author and made sure that the words were exactly what God wanted to be on the page, and so there's no human personality whatsoever, or very little, involved in the writing, which is patently absurd. You can see distinctions between the writing styles of the various authors and so forth. As far as the Torah is concerned, Wellhausen was able to discern between 4 different traditions that had been woven together at some later point in time. So yeah, anyway, another one of the fundamentals was the literal virgin birth of Jesus. Another was a literal atonement of Jesus. Another was, and I think they wanted to go with a substitutionary atonement, that Jesus took the place of the sinner and suffered in place of the sinner, so that the sinner, by means of repentance and faith, would not have to suffer, because Jesus had already done that for them. Which, if I were still involved in Christianity, I would still be inclined to agree with Pierre Abelard on the concept of atonement, that it was a moral atonement, that it wasn't by the death of Jesus that sin was atoned for, but by the life of Jesus, in that Jesus fulfilled the law which was a standard impossible to keep according to the Christian scriptures themselves, so that people wouldn't have to try to live up to an impossible standard of conduct. But at any rate, I don't follow that tradition. My own views are pre-Christian, what can be called heathen, if you will. The the concept of a literal resurrection of Jesus as well, and the belief in a literal second coming of Jesus. Those were considered like the basic 5 of the fundamentals. But the fundamentals, as the essays that were written in the 1920s, also included such things as the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, saying that Moses himself wrote all 5 books of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, if you will. Which, like I've pointed out, Julius Wellhaus and his arguments and evidence are really pretty convincing, that the separate traditions that already existed within the Hebrew sacred tradition were woven together and redacted by Ezra after the Jews, the people of the southern kingdom, returned from exile in Babylon. And there's quite a bit of other changes that occurred at the time. This is where we actually get the name Judaism, because the people before the exile were not Jews. Judaism came into existence after the 70-year Babylonian exile, when the Jews came back. The people of the southern kingdom, the Jews, the Yehudites, the people of Judah, or Yehuda, came back from Babylon. They brought with them such concepts as, well, they had encountered in the large metropolitan city of, or cosmopolitan city of Babylon, a number of other ways of thinking and so forth. And so there they had encountered the Zoroastrian religion with its concept of Ahura Mazda, the great good God, and Ahriman, or Angramanyu, the principle of fire, the principle of darkness, the evil god. So they had a good god and an evil god. But Judaism, at this point, had devolved from its original Hebrew polytheistic roots into a sort of one kingdom, one king, one God kind of concept. And so they couldn't accept the idea of a god of evil, so they came up with this idea of fallen angels, and Satan was no longer what he had been originally in the oldest text of the Bible, which is Eov, or Job, God's prosecuting attorney, or Yahweh's prosecuting attorney, or whatever. Now Satan, Hashaitan, was the leader of the fallen angels and so forth. And so anyway, I've been criticized for chasing rabbits in my videos, but it's a thing that academic people do, and that's what I was trained to be, an academic. So anyway, with regard to fundamentalism, the religious right and so forth, back in the 1920s, when they first came to be known as fundamentalists, the actual motivation for their writing these little essays, the fundamentals, was what they were calling modernism in theology, which by the time of the 70s and 80s, when you had certain people like Jerry Falwell making a lot of noise, the concept of modernism had been renamed as liberalism, theological liberalism. And so anyway, so you had this kind of multi-pronged attack where the word liberal was being assaulted from various fronts, if you will, and the religious right was one of those, so that there was some kind of conflation between theological conservatism and political conservatism, and theological liberalism and political liberalism. And of course, then at the same time, the Republican Party was being co-opted by reactionaries, social reactionaries, and right-wing economic thinkers, and moving away from conservatism as it had been characterized in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So anyway, you also had the political assault on the term liberalism to such an extent that by 1988, during the presidential debates between George Bush the Elder and Michael Dukakis could say something in one of those debates, and it was dismissed by the elder Bush with, this wasn't his exact response, but it was something like, well, that's just liberal. And that was it. And there was, if I recall correctly, there were some chuckles from the audience and so forth. And no moderator of the debate, no one actually called him on this. This was an ad hominem. It's not exactly the kind of ad hominem with which most people are familiar. Most people think that ad hominem is a personal attack. And while that is certainly a type of argumentum ad hominem, it is not the only type of that fallacy. To dismiss a person's argument by calling them a name, yes, that is abusive ad hominem. But to dismiss a person's position by calling the position a name is also a type of argumentum ad hominem. So deal with that. So that's exactly what Bush had done in that debate. And it just so happened that the insult that he used was the word liberal, which, okay, first of all, why would it being liberal be a bad thing? That was the thing that the moderator should have stepped in and done. But at this point, you had the Commission on Presidential Debates running the debates, and they weren't debates anymore. Whereas before, you had the League of Women Voters. Now, the Commission on Presidential Debates is a bipartisan corporation, privately owned corporation, and it's owned and operated by the two major parties, Democratic Party and Republican Party, whereas the League of Women Voters was a non-partisan organization, and therefore, prior to the time of the Commission on Presidential Debates coming into existence, it was more likely that you would be able to see a third-party candidate involved in the presidential debates. It was also more likely that moderators for the debates would be willing and able to call the participants, the debaters, on fallacious presentations such as argumentum ad hominem and so forth. You don't really get that anymore. There is no real debate. There is a tendency among the people involved in these so-called debates now to stand up there and see who can come up with the wittiest insult of the other, or who can impress the people by the most flowery language. And there is not much substance to what they're talking about. Now, that said, yeah, because you'd be in jail was a brilliant response from Mr. Trump. But anyway, so after the 1988 election, when Dukakis was fairly thoroughly trounced by Bush the Elder, the Democrats proposed to rebrand themselves, and what they did was they co-opted the name progressive and started referring to themselves as progressives instead of liberals sometime in the 90s. And I think they might have started that as early as 89, following the election results and so forth. But certainly sometime in the 90s, they had begun to use the term progressive. And it wasn't, like all of a sudden automatically everyone on that of that party was referring to him or herself as a progressive, but it began to be noticeable at that time and grew from there, such that you now have people being called progressive, like Vice, a magazine, which is in no way progressive. You had Hillary Clinton being presumptuous enough to claim that she was progressive before one of her audiences, and then before another one of her audiences, she pled guilty to being kind of moderate and so forth. So I mean, come on, you know, the whole thing of saying what a given audience wants to hear, it was so transparent, and that is yet another one of the many reasons why Hillary Clinton did not win the election. At any rate, and there is there are several differences between liberals and progressives, and as I think I've said before in one or more of my videos, or one or more of my appearances in streams with other people, one of the main differences between liberals and progressives is the approach that they take, with liberals tending to favor top-down imposition of the solutions that their elitist come up with, and progressives preferring to go among the people who are affected by the challenge and work with them to come up with grassroots solutions, and then, you know, have grassroots solutions brought up from below. And that's just one of many differences. I mean, as far as the history goes, as far back as you know, the first time you have mention of progressives in America, in American political dialogue and so forth, late 1800s, early 1900s, you've got people who are distinguishing themselves from liberals, as well as conservatives and moderates and so forth, and calling themselves progressives. You had progressives who were Republicans, you had progressives who were Democrats, you had the progressives in Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, and so forth. It's very clearly not the same thing as liberal, and the two terms should not be used as if they are synonymous. As far as progressives in the present day, most of the progressives of my acquaintance, and I am fairly hip to the scene, are people who don't agree with identity politics, because identity politics have come to be more about division than they are about solidarity. And liberals tend to be those who are in favor of those things, or at least the people who have some more, I don't know that I should say justification to the name liberal, but who are more in line with what were called liberals before 1988, at any rate. So, yeah, I don't think you should talk about anti-identity politics liberals when those people are really progressives. And I don't think you should talk about progressive media and include Vox in that category, because Vox is very definitely a partisan Democrat rag. And there are a number of other publications that get called progressive in the same vein as Vox, and I always just kind of shake my head and wonder how on earth people can be so easily duped by someone calling themselves something. I mean, you know, National Socialist German Workers' Party, there was nothing socialist about the Nazi Party. Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. Does anyone really believe that North Korea is democratic? Come on. You can call yourself anything, but it doesn't mean that's what you are. And so, of course, you'll have some people who will howl and piss and moan about, well, that's a no true Scotsman fallacy. No, it's not. No, it's just fucking not. And you know why it's not? Because these terms have actual meanings. Okay? You don't call yourself a Christian, claim to be a Baptist or whatever, a Southern Baptist, and then, you know, go worship Satan on the weekend or whatever. You don't claim to be um, an asatru and then go, you know, to mass at Christmas and celebrate the mass and take communion and so forth. And this is just, I mean, there are societies like China in which you can belong to multiple religions and philosophies simultaneously because they have a totally different attitude about things like that. So you could be a Confucian and a Buddhist and a Taoist, for example, and there's nobody that really gets too concerned about that because they apply to different things. Taoism is more mystical. Confucianism is more about society and politics, and Buddhism is, well, it's more of a kind of a religious thing, um, mm, more of a doctrinal kind of religious thing than the mystical tradition of Taoism. And Taoism can also be a philosophy as well as a religion, if you want to call it a religion. But yeah, there's this concept of consistency, which is one of the things that I take people to task on when they start talking about uh, the far left and purity tests. This is a ludicrous bit of rhetoric. There is no purity test. We were accused of having a purity test by the partisan Democrats who wanted us all to come out and vote for Hillary Clinton, and that's just not going to happen, guys, because it wasn't a question of purity. It just wasn't a question of purity at all. It was a question of standing for anything remotely leftist and or progressive, and Hillary Clinton did not and does not. It's questionable whether she should even be called a liberal. Um, her social um, attitudes don't seem to be particularly liberal. She gives a little lip service to some liberal concepts, perhaps, or she is willing to uh, allow a few token crumbs to fall off the table for the masses. But as far as um, being liberal, I don't know that that's that's something she could be called either. She's spoken before about her conservative roots and how she was proud of them and so forth. And as far as economics go, well, she's certainly no leftist. She's a neoliberal. And I mean, you don't have someone talking about allowing corporations to regulate themselves if they're a leftist. That's just not a thing that's done. Um, Leftism is about uh, the means of production being in the hands of the producers. And so you have various concepts of how that should be done. But capitalism is pretty much not there, and corporatism certainly isn't, and that's what neoliberalism leads towards, a kind of global corporatism, corporate globalism, global corporatism, or corporate globalism, however you want to put it. So anyway, yeah, I don't think it's fair to refer to her or to even suggest that she's remotely leftist or progressive, and I think it's rather asinine and inane to accuse us of having a purity test when the person in question does not stand for any kind of progressive or leftist policies. Um, so, yeah, again, I'm chasing rabbits, and part of the reason for that is because I've got this coffee here, and I got it to kind of wake myself up. It's 5:30 in the morning here at this point in time. So, I mean, I need the caffeine to kind of stay awake. I'm going to have to have a little bit of it right now if I can. Yeah, there we go. That's good. So, yeah, when I get tired, I will tend to perhaps to chase rabbits a little more than I would otherwise. But let me get back to this table with its two columns. I'm on the loosely anti-Gamergate column at this point, and I'd gotten to the point where I read progressive media, for example, Vox or Verge. So I went off on that and talked about progressivism and liberalism a little bit. And I'll probably come back to that at some point in the future, not in this video, but this is a topic that I've been meaning to work on for a while. I was going to do an article for my publication on Medium, The Progressive Flame, wherein I discuss the differences and distinctions between liberalism and progressivism. And in one of my previous videos, I also touched on the differences between progressivism and social justice warriors. I know a lot of social justice warriors like to call themselves progressives, but in reality, they're partisan Democrats and not progressives. Progressives tend to not be authoritarian, and social justice warriors very obviously are authoritarian. So there you have that. But the next thing in the column of loosely anti-Gamergate from this article from Slate was geek culture celebrities, for example, Joss Whedon and Will Wheaton. And I'm going to reserve any comment on either of those two fellows at this point in time. I will, however, say, shut up, Wesley. And then the next in the loosely anti-Gamergate column is gaming studies academics. And finally, so-called mainstream progressives. And once again, no, fucking no. Those people are not progressives. All right, so then the article goes on. I'm not going to read the entire article here because, frankly, I don't have the entire thing up in front of my face at the moment. And I'm not even sure I saved the entire article, but the following paragraph after the table says, with such outsized personalities involved as ex-Occupy Wall Street turned neo-reactionary Justine Tunney and WikiLeaks Julian Assange, both pro-Gamergate, as well as footballer gamer Chris Clue and hashtag cancel Colbert creator Sui Park, both very much anti. Each side has members who, under normal circumstances, would despise and loathe each other, and sometimes still do. There has been sniping between factions on both sides. The confusing online social justice movement has undergone a schismatic split during the conflict, with a heretical offshoot joining Gamergate, and there's no way that LGBTQ social justice advocates want to associate with the likes of Breitbart News for a second longer than they feel is necessary. Then there are those, such as advertisers, gaming companies, game magazines, and much of the mainstream and conservative media, who have yet to take a definite side. So then the article goes on, and it's talking about how to reduce the movement size, and it talks about the faction that this person calls the Gamergate moderate, and says, which by my estimate constitutes well over half the movement. They are the people who make up Gamergate's harassment patrol, which polices Twitter and has identified and reported some egregious harassers. 3 of them appeared on HuffPost Live. Several talked with the Washington Post's Haley Tsukayama. They have spoken mostly respectfully to those with whom they disagree on Twitter, Reddit, and blogs, and they tend to self-identify as social and economic liberals. Really? What the fuck is an economic liberal? You mean, see, you're not talking to, never mind. I'll come back to this in another, You can just go see my responses to the Late Night Echo Chamber episode 2, wherein I talk, or you can go look at the, I guess it was episode 3 or 4, where I was a guest on their stream, and we discussed the concept of economic liberty and so forth. Anyway, this person, the author of the article, goes on to say, a Gamergate moderate A, genuinely opposes harassment and does not commit it except inadvertently. B, is upset primarily with the gaming press rather than women per se. Oh, good. And C, feels sufficiently disenfranchised to support Gamergate anyway. And then it goes on and it goes on. Um, this article was obviously written by someone who was not a Gamergater and not in support of Gamergate, and has come up with, or had come up with, their what they thought was a clever plan on how to end Gamergate and move on to whatever it was they wanted us to move on to after that. Obviously, their plan did not succeed. But yes, there are factions within Gamergate, and I would certainly include Pol as one particular faction in its own right. Pol is the group of the Polacks, as they call themselves, who come from the Chan board's politically incorrect board, which I think I've talked about them before here. They are a group of people. It's like Poe's Law writ large. Poe's Law come to life as a community, because you can't tell really with some of them. I mean, there are some it's pretty obvious, but with some of them you can't tell uh, uh, whether they're actually racist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi types, or they're just being trolls and joking around and parodying and so forth. It's not easy to tell, and that may be the majority of those people. There are others who, yeah, there very definitely are um, alt-right types and neo-Nazis and white supremacists and what they're now calling themselves white nationalists or ethno-nationalists. Uh, uh, there, and then there are people who are pretty obviously just clowning around and there for shits and giggles and stuff like that. But I think the bulk of the people from Pol are more indeterminate, in the sense that you can't really tell whether they're serious or not. So anyway, then there is certainly the mainstream of Gamergate, what I think this person was referring to as the moderates, which are just the average gamer type person who was aware of the scandals that were originally called Gamergate. The nepotism and corruption within games journalist media, and the opposition to externally imposed censorship and an external ideology being imposed on the development and or publication and or localization of games, which has been more recently being more honestly, although not quite accurately, referred to as culturalization. Now, localization, and having been someone who worked in the industry, I know what we mean by localization, and that is basically just translating things more accurately instead of into English, uh, as we have referred to some of the attempts of the Asian developers and their publishers to translate things into English. It's often awkward. I mean, you've got a classic example from the game where you have all your base are belong to us. You know, it's awkward. It's kind of goofy looking. you can understand what the meaning is. All your bases are now ours. All your bases now belong to us, or whatever. But I mean, so you can tell what the meaning of it is intended to be, but it comes across as awkward and kind of goofy. And in some cases, the translation is just really not entirely intelligible. And you've got also differences in cultural attitudes. For example, in Germany, up until a certain period of time, it was not really considered that much of a shocking thing to hear the term "fick," which is fuck, uh, from a native German speaker by another native German speaker. Um, Instead, they were more concerned with any references to their ass. So if someone said something about someone's arse, they would, that was considered to be the most offensive thing imaginable. Um, so in Scotland and Ireland, and to a lesser extent in England and Wales and Cornwall, um, and perhaps the Isle of Man, I'm not sure. Um, People get called cunt all the time. Okay, men, women, boys, girls, they're called cunt, and it's a fairly common insult, and it's not really considered to be that much of a shocking term. Whereas in American English, a cunt is considered to be one of the worst things you could say to someone. On the contrary, in Scotland and Ireland particularly, if you refer to someone as a minge, that's considered much, much more graphic and offensive, and a minge is a septic vagina. Uh, so, I mean, it's kind of the same concept, but it's like a diseased and septic part of a woman's anatomy. Um, Now, it used to be the case that the word prick was considered to be rather offensive when applied to a man in the United States. That's a term that you hear quite often also in Scotland and Ireland, and I guess I'm not really sure how common it is in England and Wales and Cornwall and the Isle of Man, but certainly in Scotland. Certainly in Scotland, you'll hear people talk about others and say things like, "Well, he's a well-known prick," and things like that. And it's not particularly thought of as overly offensive or coarse or vulgar or whatever. So cultural attitudes do have a great deal to do with what one thinks is a taboo in terms of language. Um, so, for example, we had these issues with our language filter in one of the games that we published at one of the companies I worked for, the last company I worked for in the gaming industry. The filter had censored the very common and mild, hardly offensive word crap, um, because the developers from South Korea did not understand the nuance difference between shit and crap. Um, I don't I don't remember all the things that they had censored that were relatively calm and mild and inoffensive. I mean, they even had censored the word lesbian, um, as if it were somehow a bad word. So, I mean, there's that kind of issue with localization, and that's what localization really means. But you have some people who have been trying to impose their own um, ideologically based concepts of propriety and impropriety on games. So, for example, you'll find uh, a female character in a Japanese game who's wearing what is not particularly uh, over the top kind of scanty clothing. But when it gets brought to the United States, they get covered up even more. You find uh, other examples of communication between two characters in a game that gets translated in a completely different manner. And it makes no sense why they would do that. There's nothing even remotely offensive, even to the most easily triggered SJW. I don't understand what the point is of totally changing the story there. But anyway, so that's not the same thing as localization at all. It is instead a sort of an imposition of one's own personal biases, I guess you would say, onto the game. And I don't think that's really appropriate, and I think there are plenty of other people who agree with me on that, particularly within Gamergate. So yeah, there's that issue. So I think that the so-called Gamergate moderate, or the mainstream of Gamergate, are people who are just normal gamers, and some of them are developers or other industry insiders, and they're not particularly interested in some of the wider ideological struggles, if you will. They just want to develop and publish and play their games in peace without some asshole coming in and trying to dictate to them what they can and can't do. And most of these people are indeed outsiders in the sense that they don't play games and they're not developers. Some of them claim to be, admittedly, but how justified such claims may be is a matter of some debate. At any rate, the issue is sort of, look, man, this ain't even your thing. We're nerds. We've been picked on all our lives. We've been bullied. We've been stuffed in lockers. We've had wedgies and all this shit, back in elementary and junior high, or I guess it's middle school now, and high school. And, we're not going to keep putting up with it now that we're adults. Oh, yeah, and there's another thing, too. Not all Gamergaters are, 15-year-old white male, whatever. No, no, no. There are Gamergaters of varying ages. I myself, as I've pointed out before, I'm from Generation X. I remember when Star Trek, the original series, was not in reruns. Before it was in syndication at all. I remember when the Beatles split up. Okay. I remember when Dark Shadows was on television in its original run. So, I'm not old, but I'm not young, you know. So anyway, there's that. Obviously, I'm female. I'm all these different little things, these little boxes into which they try to put Gamergate supporters, or Gamergaters, or whatever you want to call us. They don't really work, and that was the origin of the Not Your Shield hashtag. Was you guys keep trying to act like you're speaking on behalf of minorities, women, LGBTI, racial, ethnic minorities, and so forth. And you're not, because we've got our own voices and we can speak for ourselves. Thanks, but no thanks. So butt the fuck out. This is our thing. We are the nerds. You're some fucking, self-righteous busybody who wants to come over here and keep fucking with us and calling us names just like you did back in high school and junior high and elementary and so forth. And, we don't have to put up with it, and we're not going to. So go fuck yourselves. And no, this ain't got anything to do with harassment of women either. I mean, yeah, sir. I mean, there may be some misogynists and sexists and chauvinists, and they're not the same things. Those three words all mean something different, you dumb shits. And you shouldn't use them synonymously. There may be some people in Gamergate who are one or another of those things, or some combination thereof. But they're by no means a majority, or even, you know, a fraction worthy of consideration, and certainly not to be conflated with the entire group of us. You know, and certainly there are young people, but there are older people. There are people older than me who are in Gamergate. Um, there are whites and blacks and Asians and Hispanics and everyone else under the sun. There are men and women, and boys and girls, and gays and straights, and lesbians and bisexuals and transsexuals and intersex people, all over the rainbow. Okay? So just stop with your false narrative and stop accusing us of shit. Uh, you know, understand that, yes, as the Slate article stated, we are an amorphous, leaderless movement. Now, I understand what QQ was talking about in terms of Gamergate having been the name of the scandal or scandals um, in the early days of what is now called Gamergate as a movement. But we are now, whether we were initially back in August of 2014 or not, we are now a movement. And um, whether there is some distinction between us and the mass of gamers in general, or players as some would call them, and really honestly, player is a term that's used in the industry. And what player means in the industry is these are people who play our games, okay? They're players, okay? Um, and it includes gamers. And some of those people are, you know, what might be called filthy casuals, and some of them are hardcore. Um, some of them are gamers because they love games, and some of them are players because they do it, you know, as a means of relaxing or escaping, or, you know, just having fun or whatever. But seriously, we don't need you outsiders coming in and telling us how we have to make our games, how we have to publish our games, what kind of ratings we can give them, um, what language we can use in our games, or what kind of depictions of people we can have in our games, what kind of clothing or armor we put our male and or female characters into in the games, uh, what where they can wear certain things and where they can't wear certain things. This is fucking obnoxious horse shit. And, you know, you guys can go off somewhere else and mess with what you think is culture somewhere else. And while I'm on the subject, I am going to, I want to make a video. I intend to make a video, and I thought it would have been my last video, the 8th video that I did, uh, and I still haven't gotten to it, and this is my 9th. So I don't know when I will get to it, but I do want to address this concept, this word ideology, because I see a lot of it, and some people mispronounce it as ideology. It's ideology, people. Some people have the mistaken concept that ideology is something bad, and that it's a particular belief system connected with social justice warriors and third wave feminists and so forth. That's not what ideology is, people. An ideology is a group of beliefs and practices, mostly beliefs, and there are a number of different ideologies. Everyone has an ideology. Uh, it's just sort of the concepts that underlie your worldview, and it can be cultural, it can be religious, it can be political, it can be economic. Um, the list goes on. Anti-feminism is an ideology. Okay, various perspectives within the various waves of feminism are ideologies. Um, Trotskyism is an ideology, libertarianism is an ideology, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, I'll get into that in some greater detail in a future video, maybe, or perhaps some op-ed or the like. And my goodness, I think this is the longest Oh, no, it's not. But it's a pretty long video, and I probably rambled on a little bit too much about the rabbit chases. But those were things that I wanted to say and needed to be said, and I would have said them eventually anyway. So you got one big dose here instead of tiny bite-sized morsels. But you're all big boys and girls, and I think you can digest all of that. So, at any rate, before this does get to rival the length of my longest video to date, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off and upload it and so forth. But, and I'm also going to finish my coffee. Yeah. Anyway, QQ, apologies for my previous mischaracterization of you as an asshole and so forth, and I'm glad we did have our conversation and come to an understanding in our sort of a non-aggression pact, if you will. Um, so, well, with that, I'm going to beam up and warp out, and everyone have fun, but stay safe. Live long and prosper.